Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. India's troubles and protests with the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act continue. As we discussed last night, the bill was passed by both houses of India's parliament and immediately signed into law by the country's president. Since then, 5 states in that country have refused to enact and enforce the law. Protests have erupted in several cities. Civil society activists, political opposition, intellectuals, students, almost everyone seems to be taking to the streets. According to Indian media, protests over the CAA have intensified across the country and are not petering out. The BJP government seems to have doubled down, resorting to heavy police deployment, internet clampdown, shutting of metro stations, and blocking highways. As we mentioned yesterday, even on Twitter, official police handles have been warning prominent people to not say anything about the controversial law. What's going on? To discuss the situation, we have with us Rajiv Desai, who joins us from Delhi. Mr. Desai writes about change and cities and lots of other things, lifestyle also, dogma. Thank you, Mr. Desai, for being with us. We also have Mr. Zaffar Qureshi with us, who's chairman of Kashmir Campaign Global, joins us from London, where he lives in self-exile. Dr. Ilhan Niaz, who's an associate professor of history at the Quaid-e-Azam University, and he joins us from Islamabad. Thank you to all my guests. Let me begin with Mr. Desai. Mr. Desai, yesterday I did this program, and I also had the BJP spokesperson on the program, Mr. Rajiv Desai. When I asked him about this, his first question back to me was, why is this being termed as controversial? So I was taken aback a little, and so I said to him that what exactly are the protests about if this law is not controversial? So he said, well, you know, this is actually not about CAA, this is about the NRC, and NRC has not even been enacted. So, and then he went on to say that, Congress and other political opposition, they really do not have an argument here. I want to hear your view, sir, about how the BJP is looking at this.
First of all, I would say that the BJP at this moment is scared. No one anticipated this kind of upheaval, this kind of spontaneous protest. And there have been protests in more than 25 cities involving hundreds of thousands of people. There are normally not the kind of people who would come out and protest. Students, scholars, middle-class people, those kinds of people have come out. And they're truly shocked by this. And they have no response. So they have tried to pin the blame on, quote-unquote, other political parties. Now, if you really think that a political party with just 60 seats in the House can organize something like this, then it should be in power, right? But the fact is, it isn't. That's number one. Number two, I think that this whole uproar comes from 6 years of deception and repression. Mr. Modi and his cohorts have become famous from taking public attention from subject to subject without really answering the question. So, for example, they when the election is coming up, they will usually try and create a polarized kind of a situation. And in other cases, they just want to avoid answering any questions on the economy, which they have driven to the ground completely. There is no investment, there are no jobs, the prices have risen. There's unbelievable chaos of the kind I've not seen. In the 30 years that I've been here, I've never seen anything like this. And I think this is a spontaneous cry against the deception and the repression.
Mr. Desai, you're saying that this is spontaneous, and I agree with you. But what bemused me mildly yesterday when I was talking to Mr. Desai, because he said that the opposition is playing in the hands of some foreign country. And then during the debate, since I had another, eminent Indian on the panel also, Mr. Shrivastava, Mr. Jaitley said to me, Mr. Shrivastava, when he began to criticize this law, he said, people like you should go to Pakistan. Now, what I want to ask you is this now become a BJP mantra whenever something goes south or sideways, that, it's easy to just pin it on Pakistan or say, well, anyone who's critical is either in the pay of Pakistan or should just go to Pakistan?
I don't know about the pay of Pakistan, but certainly should go to Pakistan. That's a very common refrain we've heard in these past 6 years. That's a very common refrain. But remember one thing, that there would have been no BJP without partition. At the time of partition, a lot of these disgruntled people who in Punjab and elsewhere, who were affected by the displacement, a small group of them formed what was then called the Jan Sangh, which became a sort of a Hindu nationalist party, who felt that if Pakistanis got a nation on the basis of religion, we too should have a nation on the basis of religion. And it's these Congress guys, including Nehru and all, who tried to make us secular. And we don't accept that. And over a period of time, they grew from strength to strength, largely because the ruling parties, previously the Congress and others, took a very lackadaisical attitude towards their entire embrace of this Hindu nationalism. That's number one. Number two, also they were stuck in the secular socialist kind of order, which they also, the BJP people exploited. And that's how they rose to power. Then they couldn't find anything, so they did this whole Babri Masjid thing, from all over. And that was the big turning point. And from there, they haven't looked back. And they finally ended up forming this government, which for 6 years has tried to deceive the entire public by saying, look, we're doing everything we can on the economy. But wait, there's a communal fire here.
Right, I get your point, Mr. Desai. And it's, pertinent that we have a very eminent historian here. And let me ask him, Dr. Ilhan Niaz, about the direction of causality. That there would have been no BJP if there were no Pakistan, or there would have probably been no Pakistan if there weren't already people like Golwalkar and Savarkar and various others. Dr. Niaz, what is your take on the direction of causality here?
Well, I mean, just as a matter of simple chronology, Hindu nationalism predates the partition of the Indian subcontinent. So you can't blame the partition of India for the emergence of Hindu nationalism per se. Also, the failure of Congress to deliver on a wide range of promises, developmental, economic, etc., did a lot to create a fertile ground for the emergence of the politics of identity. But this is not something which is unique to India. You see that happening in other countries as well. Reference another important episode in Indian history. When you look at what the BJP leaders and others are saying, their rhetoric reference to the protesters is very similar to the rhetoric that Indira Gandhi adopted in 1974 and then leading on to the emergency of 1975, i.e. she was also talking about how the opposition is creating internal disturbances and great powers are trying to destabilize India, etc. And that all snowballed into her imposition of an emergency. I suspect that is the direction in which the BJP might head if the protests escalate, if they spread to other sectors, if they bring in other groups of people onto the streets. And interestingly, again, when Indira Gandhi declared the emergency, the spark that basically lit the protests against her was increase in fees in Gujarat. And then from there, students came out to protests, railway workers joined them, other people joined them, and eventually she was left, in her view, with no option but to impose an emergency. So I suspect that is where the BJP would likely head if this situation continues as it is.
Okay, that's clear and precise. Thank you, Dr. Niaz. But before I go back to Mr. Desai, let me go across to Mrs. Zaffar Qureshi. Ms. Zaffar Qureshi, when there was this clampdown in Kashmir, and of course the annexation and all of this, at least to the extent of the social media and also in mainstream media, there was a certain element of joy in mainland India. But now it seems that partially the kind of, techniques or repressive techniques, I would say, that the BJP government has used in Kashmir are being witnessed in mainland India. Do you think this would have some kind of salutary impact in terms of how the mainland Indians look at Kashmir, or do you think that's not going to happen?
Right. I want to just say thank you for the opportunity, and also want to say to the peace-loving people of India whose democratic rights have been snatched away and who at the moment are standing for their democratic constitutional rights against the government, the fascist government, who's trying to impose a dictatorship and a Hindutva regime, that we, the people of Kashmir, stand by you in these turbulent times. Even though, as you rightly said, prior to 5th of August, or prior to this 2019 CAA, the mainstream India could not feel what it felt to be a Kashmiri when our human rights were snatched, when our communication was gagged, when the people of Kashmir were showered with the pellets by the Indian forces. But I think that there's a realization that when it's hit the home grounds in India, some of the brutalities that the people of India are facing, they've come to realize how a Kashmiri would have felt. What we've been going through. So we are seeing in the social media quite a lot of support from the Indian mainstream, people coming out to India to say, oh, now we know what it feels to be like a Kashmiri, or what the Kashmiris go through. And I just want to say, yes, we do support you. We are there in terms of this grief when your rights have been snatched. But at the same time, our struggle has been there for the last 73 years. We've been facing these brutalities for over 70 years now, every day being killed, maimed, and gagged by the Indian Armed Forces.
Okay. Let me go back to Mr. Desai. Mr. Desai, now let's come back to the present. Dr. Niaz gave us a sort of peek into history, and he also referred to what Mrs. Gandhi did in the run-up to the emergency. And he also fears that that might now be the case in the event that the protests become more vociferous. Would you share that fear that, since the government is doubling down on the protests, that if the situation, it seems that the situation is getting out of hand, that it could move towards such a drastic step?
Well, I guess... first of all, I would like to make one correction. I never did say anything about Hindu nationalism being equated with partition. I said partition gave a political fillip to Jansangh, which became the BJP. So that's just a record-keeping issue. That's number one. Number two, yes, I'm afraid that they have actually seemed to be losing control over the situation. And they also have taken some really silly steps. They've tried to double down on it and then back off, and then double down again and then back off. So they don't seem to know what they're doing. Now the question is, what are they going to do? Something like this of an emergency type of situation. Some people feel indeed that a lot of these riots and protests, in some of them, are instigated actually by the other side, the people who might be on the RSS side, who are instigating these riots and so forth, specifically to enable the government to declare an emergency. Because after the emergency, there was an amendment saying that you can't really declare an emergency on the basis of internal disturbances. But let's see how that goes. But the government certainly is in a dither. They seem to be lost. They don't know what they're doing. They don't seem to know what they're doing. And their instinctive reaction to this kind of uncertainty is repression and more repression. And that will lead to protest and more protest, because this is protest from all around the country. It's not just one group of people.
Absolutely. Mr. Desai, one last question, and rather quickly, because I have to wrap up the segment also. This does seem ironic that, just a few months ago, the BJP and its allies have been returned to Lok Sabha, with massive majority, and now suddenly this situation. Does this seem to indicate that the other realities have started sort of, expressing themselves, and just the Pakistan bashing rhetoric that BJP relied on in the run-up to the recent elections is now kind of petering out?
I don't know what petering out. I think that there'll always remain a solid core of people like that. But I have been saying since 2014, not about so much about the horns of this government, the communalism, the nationalism, the chauvinism, but about their incompetence.
Yes, I remember you. Yeah. You made this point last time you were on my program. You made this point. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Desai speaking with us. Quickly go to Dr. Ilhan Niaz. Ilhan, you said there's an emergency. Mr. Desai talked about the fact that post that emergency, there is some constitutional arrangement that precludes internal disturbances as to be used as a pretext for emergency. But do you think that, given the sort of fascist mode in which the BJP RSS government is, that they would actually go by the constitutional nuances and on legal sort of nuances?
Well, when it came to their annexation of Kashmir back in August, there they basically were able to alter the constitution by a presidential fiat, and they might do that again. So, as we had also said earlier, myself on your show, and you'd also raised this point, that what's more significant if you're in India, living in mainland India, is that by testing the resilience of the constitutional structures and finding them unable to push back, reference the amendment to 370, that is setting the stage for more similar types of legislative coups by the government. So I don't think that this government would particularly care about any specific legislation that would bar them from doing this or that. If an emergency situation arises, if they are able to instigate the violence or on a sufficiently large scale, there is nothing stopping them from, let us say, first imposing president's rule in many of the affected areas, or then going for a full-fledged emergency. I think that if they take such an extra constitutional step, the Indian judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, has also in a way signaled that it has a soft corner for such moves. You see that in the verdict reference the demolition of the Babri Masjid. You also see this, of course, reference the very slow response to what happened with the annexation of Kashmir by the Indians back in August.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Ilhan Niaz speaking with us. I'll go back to Mr. Zaffar Qureshi. Mr. Qureshi, a slightly different question in the sense that there are now reports with reference to occupied and annexed Kashmir that the BJP government is trying to look for people that can be the next generation Quislings, because the previous Quislings are not going to play ball. But, people like Mir Junaid and various others who seem to be now living under protection, but seem to be trying to, through the panchayati system and through various other structures, to try and put together some kind of new political force. Do you think that's going to succeed, or do you think that's going to just fizzle out?
Unfortunately, yes, India is still not backing up from its old tricks in trying to befool the people of Kashmir. You're right, India has been, especially the BJP government, has been for the last few months, in fact years, been trying to work on a new Kuzlings, as you just rightly call them, to bring up and try to motivate the people of Kashmir. But alhamdulillah, I think the people of Kashmir have realized that these are the tricks that the India is playing with them, and there's no sincerity from the Indian government to come on the table and look after the welfare of the people of Kashmir. I think most of the people have now woken up and they will not fall for these tricks. They've realized that any administrative government, we do specifically refer to them as an administrative because it's the pro-freedom movement that is the mainstream, which the majority of the Kashmiris follow and abide by, not the puppeteer administrative stream.
Thank
so
you.
I don't think this is going to be
okay. Go on.
Sorry.
Go on, Mr. Qureshi.
Yeah, I don't believe it is going to be a success. It may lure some few percentage of the people within the Kashmir who have sold their souls, but on the majority, I think people will definitely refute this and will not follow this trickery again.
Thank you, Mr. Zaffar Qureshi, speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the situation in Afghanistan and also Iranian statement with reference to US Taliban talks. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. In an interesting development, Iran's Secretary of Supreme National Security Council has opposed US talks with Taliban without the inclusion of Afghan people and the government. And he said, and I quote, "Any strategy, any decision or plan without the participation of the Afghan people is wrong and doomed to failure." This is Rear Admiral Ali Shamkhani. He also added the Taliban are a reality of the Afghan people that cannot be ignored. But are all Afghans Taliban? And a rhetorical question. And then he said, no. Shamkhani was speaking at a news conference following a meeting in Tehran of senior national security officials from Afghanistan, China, India, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Russia. A US Taliban deal was ready for signing in early September, but President Donald Trump scuttled the agreement at the last minute, citing ongoing Taliban violence. Talks resumed December 7, but have again been paused for after another Taliban attack, this time at the Bagram air base north of the Afghan capital. According to a draft of the September agreement, the Taliban were to commit to security measures, launch a dialogue with the Afghan government, and reduce violence in exchange for the withdrawal of American forces. To discuss the situation in Afghanistan and Iranian signaling, we have with us Christian Kaunert. He is chair of policing and security and also director of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of Wales. He joins us from London. We also have with us Mr. Emraan Feroz, who's a journalist, Afghan journalist based in Germany. Thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Dr. Kaunert here. Dr. Kaunert, is this Iranian statement? It's kind of interesting, and as I said, seems like some kind of signaling going on. How would you put this in the larger perspective of the US Taliban talks, reservations about those talks within Afghanistan also, and the deteriorating US-Iran relations?
Yes, hello. Thank you for having me on the program. I think, indeed, as you rightly say, this is rather interesting. Firstly, it's interesting because there is these talks going on at all, because as you probably know, that within the U.S. military establishment, support for these talks is absolutely at a quite low. So these are talks that are particularly pushed by President Trump himself. So there's that first point. The second point is, of course, that the United States, ever since President Trump came to power, has been trying to isolate Iran and has been trying to keep Iran as much out of the geopolitical picture as possible. Of course, scattering the trade the deal with Iran on nuclear power. So all of this is interesting in the sense that, in a way, it hasn't been possible to totally isolate Iran. I think this has become clear for a little while. Iran is very important, in particular in relation to Afghanistan. Iran has been having interestingly strong relations also with the Taliban. So therefore, it shouldn't surprise us too much that Iran wants to push the stock and in a sense also have the Taliban at the table. But of course, it is a controversial story also in Afghanistan. I think the other speaker is probably more qualified to talk about this, but I think it's a very interesting geopolitical picture that kind of presents itself where we have conflicting interests between the various parties.
Absolutely. Since you mentioned the U.S. Army's sort of lack of appetite for any immediate peace talks, it was interesting how the Afghan papers, kind of the Pentagon Papers redux, appeared in U.S. publications, which talked about how the generals and the diplomats and, everybody, including Charlie's aunt, was, essentially lying to the American public. But give me a sense of, since you said that the Iranians close to the Taliban, this particular statement also mentions that, and interestingly says, well, the Americans came to us and through back channels and said, we need you to help us with the Taliban, and we did. And what did it get us? It got us into that, axis of evil sort of, branding by President Bush. So it seems to me that the Iranians are just trying to say, well, you do need us still if you want to have some kind of regional arrangement here. Do you think that makes sense from the Iranian point of view? Have I got that right?
No, absolutely. I think the Iranians have been very careful from the beginning not to cut any channels towards the Taliban. They've been increasingly close towards the Taliban because it is an important, in a sense, lever of power that they have towards the United States and towards having any kind of influence in Afghanistan. So they have been pursuing this line, so this is not particularly surprising. They're right to point out that, in a sense, they were trying to be helpful to the United States, in particular at the time when the war initially started. But of course, as you rightly pointed out, the United States then had a different line in terms of their policy towards Iran as a whole. And as you rightly pointed out, they did land in the axis of evil. Now, if you're going to have an agreement and a peace talk in Afghanistan, and if that is to include the Taliban, then it's probably difficult to entirely exclude Iran because of their influence that there is. And the Iranians are playing that card right now, and particularly it's very interesting, of course, because of the economic sanctions and all of this. So this is a kind of little signal, as you said earlier, to say, well, you're trying to keep us out of matters, but we are still important. We're a regional power here, and you can't just sideline us entirely.
Absolutely. Let me pull in Emraan Feroz here. Mr. Feroz, what is your reading of the statement? But also give us a sense of the situation within Afghanistan, especially with reference to the fact that when we talk about the government in Kabul, we have a government which is kind of in limbo because there are still no results of the presidential elections. So first on the Iranian statement, and then on the political situation in Afghanistan.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me. Great to talk with you. Regarding the Iranian statement, I think the other speaker already said a lot of important things. So the Iranians had and still have their connections with the Taliban. Back then, when the Americans invaded Afghanistan, many observers all around the world, not just inside Afghanistan, but also outside Afghanistan, believed that this happened because the Americans and its allies wanted to have an eye on Iran, a very close eye. So for that reason, the Iranians started to get in touch with the Taliban, although they have been quite enemies during the times of the Taliban regime.
Correct.
And there were always rumors of weapon support, logistic support regarding Iran and the Taliban. Also similar with other regional neighbors, but
also with reference to Russia. Those were the American
Exactly.
reports. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly, yes. And what is always interesting in this case, in such cases, is that if you're inside Afghanistan, you hear these things much more earlier than you hear in Western countries. For example, I remember when I've been there in 2014, there was already more than enough evidence that Russia is kind of playing its own geopolitical game in Afghanistan by supporting the Taliban. The same with Iran, because it's an opportunity for them to behave somehow against the Americans. And I think the main issue of all of that is that we have all these external global players who try to play their game in Afghanistan on the shoulders of the Afghan people. Regarding your second question about the Afghan government and the current peace talks, so it is true that many people believe that the deal cannot happen without the Afghan government in Kabul. But as you said, so there are two crucial points. First of all, how legitimate is this government? The 2014 election, which was, many Afghans back then were very enthusiastic back then and went to the ballots to vote. And at the end, the Afghan president, who is also now the President Ashraf Ghani, was actually not elected by the Afghan people. He was selected by then Foreign Secretary John Kerry. And as you already mentioned, now we're still waiting for the election results. Elections took place more than 2 months ago, and mostly I speak for myself. But now I think I speak for many Afghans when I say it's totally embarrassing how much time it takes to get this result, especially if we consider that not many people actually went to vote. So even if we have a result, we should ask ourselves if it's legitimate, because the total majority of the Afghan people did not give their vote and lost their hope in this political system.
Absolutely. I hear you loud and clear, Emraan Feroz, a journalist. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Let me go back to Dr. Kaunert there. Dr. Kaunert, this is an issue. I mean, of course, it's a legitimate thing to bring in other Afghan stakeholders and obviously the Afghan government. But the question is, which Afghan government? And Emraan Feroz just said that, and he said that, it's not just him, but he's expressing the feelings of lots of Afghans. So this issue of who's going to form the government also becomes central to the issue of a deal and therefore peace in Afghanistan.
Yes, indeed. I think it is always of vital importance in Afghanistan being such a fragile state. In fact, of course, any kind of fear about, where those elections may be not entirely free and fair and all of those kind of issues, they do come in. And being in such a fragile state as it is right now is obviously something that carries a lot of weight when it comes to larger peace talks. But at the same time, without whoever is in power, it's very difficult to implement any deal, whatever that might be, with the Taliban. So I think while it is difficult, it is probably impossible to sideline whoever will be in power.
Let me ask you another question. Since you are an expert in matters of policing and security, have you studied how the US and its allies try to develop the Afghan, not just the Afghan National Security Forces, but the Afghan police? Because it seems to me, whenever I've been to Kabul or elsewhere, that the police seems to be divided on ethnic lines. If you've got the Uzbeks there, they'll have a picture of Dostum there. If you've got Tajiks there, they'll have a picture of Masood there, and so on and so forth. So do you really think that these 18 or 19-year efforts have actually managed to develop a professional police?
Well, I think it always depends from which standards you're coming. I think it is very clear that if you were to compare them to any kind of Western-style policing, it's obviously nowhere near those kind of standards. And I think it would probably be foolish to think that you could achieve that, whether that is in 20 years or 40 years, because in a sense, the police is a reflection of society at large, because the police is in fact a representation of society at large. And what we have in Afghanistan even today is, of course, a very, very divided society. And as you rightly point out, with different ethnicities and different kind of leaders of those ethnic groups, it is next to impossible to develop a coherent police force. And even in highly developed parts of Western countries, such as Northern Ireland. In fact, establishing a unified police force is one of the largest and most difficult tasks that there is, because it is this representation of society. If people feel that they're not sufficiently represented within the police force, that immediately undermines legitimacy of the police force. If you undermine the legitimacy of the police force, in essence, you're undermining the legitimacy of the state. So it is very, very difficult, and it's probably the most difficult task that you can achieve. So measured by that standard, we have progressed a lot, but at the same time, we also bear in mind that it is a very, very difficult mountain that we need to climb.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Christian Kaunert speaking with us. I am also joined by Hamdullah Hamdard, who's Director of Public Relations Coordination at the Administrative Office of the President. Thank you, Mr. Hamdard, for being with us. Give me a sense of what exactly is happening in terms of the politics, because while this government is going on post-presidential elections, there are no results. So give me a sense of how that's going to impact on governance and also on the whole idea of peace talks with the Taliban.
Thank you, Ejaz Haider Saib. The vote recount process has started, and the 7 provinces which were stopped by Abdullah's supporters, the recount has started, and that will be finished soon. And we are expecting the primary result very soon, probably within a day or two. And beside that, the peace process, you're in the picture, that's also going on, and there is a pause between Taliban and Zalmay Khalilzad on the Afghan peace deal. Taliban are going to discuss the final deal with their leadership council. And Zalmay Khalilzad, however, has said that it is just because of the Taliban's attack on the Bagram airfield, but I guess it's not because of that. It is because they have given chance, or they have given time to Taliban to discuss or consult the final deal with their leadership. However, the concerns are there. If the US and Taliban do not agree with the Afghan government and do not include the Afghan government in the peace process, there will be no peace in Afghanistan. It will be just a deal which will not have a positive result, which will not be sustainable, and which will not work in Afghanistan.
I agree with you, Mr. Hamdard. I totally agree with you. But if you put yourself in their shoes, the Taliban shoes, once this thing is signed, then their next question would be, okay, which government or who are we going to talk to?
The Islamic Republic of Afghanistan is the legal representative of the people of Afghanistan, and we are waiting for the results of the presidential elections. Once the results are out, then the next president, whoever becomes the next president, will be ready to talk with the Taliban and to do, to continue the intra-Afghan peace talks. And the deal which will be signed between the US and the Taliban, in that as well, the Afghan government should be in the picture. The United States and Taliban should agree with the conditions and with the demands of the Afghan government. If the Afghan government is not in the picture, and if Afghan government does not lead this process, once again, I insist on this, it will not have any result that people are expecting in Afghanistan.
Okay, one final question and a very quick answer before I wrap up. If one or the other party says we do not accept these results, then are you fearing a deadlock? Is there a way out of that?
if one of the parties completes the 50 plus 1%, then the other party who does not accept it is not important for the people, and people will not allow that. But however, if neither of the parties completes or obtain 50 plus 1% of the total votes, then of course the elections will have to go to the second round, and the top two candidates will have to proceed to the second round, and they will have to compete once again. This time it's not 2014, and people cannot tolerate any kind of withdrawal from the elections or any kind of rejection of the elections results. People are not ready to accept that anymore because people are killed every day. The economy is going worse day by day due to the election results delay. So that's the final question.
Thank you so much. That was Hamdullah Hamdard speaking with us. This is all for this week from Indus Special. We shall see you next week at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.